In a world where strength is measured by what you have, not what you've overcome, Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of everything she'd ever dreamed of losing. The military base buzzed with the familiar sounds of boots on concrete, orders being barked, and the distant crack of rifle fire from the training range. But for Sarah, these sounds carried a different weight now. They weren't just the soundtrack of her career. They were the echoes of a life she wasn't sure she could still claim. The accident had taken her left leg below the knee, but it had given her something far more dangerous: the burning need to prove that she was more than the sum of her missing parts. What the generals, the fellow soldiers, and even her own family didn't understand was that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one you're born with. It's the one forged in the fire of being underestimated. This is the story of a woman who discovered that true strength isn't about having all your pieces. It's about making the pieces you have count when everything is on the line. Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately commanded attention, not because she tried to, but because confidence seemed to radiate from her very core. At 28, she had already spent 6 years in the Army, working her way up through the ranks with a combination of natural talent, relentless determination, and an almost supernatural ability to hit targets that others couldn't even see clearly. Her fellow soldiers respected her, her superiors valued her skills, and she had built a life around the certainty that she belonged exactly where she was. The morning of March 15th started like any other training day at Fort Braxton. Sarah woke before her alarm, as she always did, and completed her usual routine of push-ups, sit-ups, and a 5-mile run around the base perimeter. The North Carolina air was crisp with the promise of spring, and as she ran, she felt that familiar surge of gratitude for the life she had built. She loved the structure, the purpose, the way every day brought new challenges that pushed her to be better than she was the day before. After breakfast in the mess hall, Sarah joined her unit for what should have been a routine training exercise in explosive ordnance disposal. She had done similar exercises dozens of times before, and her hands moved with practiced precision as she worked to disarm the training device. But training devices, no matter how carefully constructed, sometimes fail in unexpected ways. A malfunction in the timing mechanism caused the device to detonate earlier than programmed, and in the split second between recognition and reaction, Sarah's world changed forever. The explosion threw her backward, and the last thing she remembered clearly was the strange silence that followed the deafening blast, as if the world had suddenly been wrapped in cotton. When she woke up 3 days later in the base hospital, the first thing she noticed was how different the ceiling looked from this angle. The second thing she noticed was the absence of sensation where her left leg should have been. Dr. Patricia Collins was the one who delivered the news with a professional gentleness that somehow made it both easier and harder to hear. The blast had caused massive trauma to Sarah's left leg, and despite the best efforts of the surgical team, amputation below the knee had been necessary to save her life. Sarah listened to the explanation of prosthetics and rehabilitation, of the advances in adaptive technology, and the success stories of other amputees who had gone on to live full, productive lives. But all Sarah could think about was the rifle range, the weight of her weapon in her hands, the perfect balance she had cultivated over years of practice. She thought about the way she could feel the ground beneath her feet when she took her shooting stance, how every part of her body worked in harmony to achieve the precision that had made her one of the best marksmen in her unit. How could any of that be the same when part of her was simply gone? The first weeks of recovery were a blur of physical therapy, meetings with prosthetic specialists, and well-meaning visits from friends and fellow soldiers who struggled to find the right words. Everyone was encouraging, everyone was positive, and everyone seemed to believe that Sarah's attitude would determine her success in adapting to her new reality. What they didn't understand was that Sarah's attitude was precisely the problem. She had never been the kind of person who accepted limitations, and she couldn't shake the feeling that accepting this new version of herself would be a fundamental betrayal of who she had always been. The prosthetic fitting process was more complex than Sarah had anticipated. The prosthetist, a cheerful man named David Kim, explained that modern prosthetics were marvels of engineering, capable of providing mobility and function that would have been unimaginable just a few decades earlier. The device that would replace her missing limb was lightweight, sophisticated, and designed to integrate as seamlessly as possible with her remaining anatomy. But wearing it felt like carrying around a constant reminder of everything she had lost. The weight was different, the balance was different, and every step required a conscious thought that had never been necessary before. Sarah found herself analyzing every movement, questioning every decision, and wondering if the person she was becoming bore any resemblance to the person she had been. Physical therapy became a daily battle between Sarah's determination to push forward and her growing frustration with the limitations of her new reality. Her therapist, Maria Santos, was patient and skilled, but Sarah could see the concern in her eyes when sessions didn't go as planned. Learning to walk again was harder than Sarah had expected, not because of the physical challenge, but because it forced her to confront the fact that things she had taken for granted her entire life now required conscious effort and planning. The hardest part wasn't the pain or the difficulty of movement. The hardest part was the way people looked at her now. Where once she had seen respect and recognition in the eyes of her fellow soldiers, now she saw pity and uncertainty. Conversations that had once flowed naturally now felt forced and awkward, as if everyone was carefully avoiding any topic that might remind her of what she had lost. Sarah's commanding officer, Colonel James Bradley, visited regularly during her recovery, and while his intentions were clearly good, his words carried an undertone that Sarah found increasingly difficult to ignore. He spoke about alternative career paths, about valuable contributions she could make in administrative roles, about the importance of accepting help and support from others. What he didn't say, but what Sarah heard clearly, was that her days as an active soldier were over. 3 months after the accident, Sarah was cleared for limited duty and given a desk assignment in the base's administrative offices. She spent her days processing paperwork, coordinating schedules, and handling communication between different departments. The work was important, and she tried to convince herself that she was still making a meaningful contribution. But every time she heard the sound of training exercises in the distance, she felt a piece of her identity slip a little further away. Her new office had a window that looked out toward the rifle range, and Sarah found herself staring in that direction more often than she cared to admit. She could see the soldiers taking their positions, adjusting their stances, and focusing their attention with the kind of intense concentration she remembered so well. Part of her wanted to look away, to focus on the present reality, rather than dwelling on what she could no longer do. But another part of her couldn't stop watching, as if maintaining that connection might somehow preserve the person she used to be. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon in late June, when Sarah was leaving the administrative building and overheard a conversation between 2 junior officers. They were discussing upcoming training exercises and debating which soldiers should be assigned to various roles. One of them mentioned Sarah's name, and the other responded with a dismissive comment about how she used to be one of the best marksmen on base, but now she was basically just filing paperwork. Sarah stopped walking and felt a familiar surge of anger rise in her chest. But this time, the anger wasn't directed at her circumstances or her limitations. It was directed at the assumptions that everyone seemed to be making about what she could and couldn't do. She realized that she had been so focused on mourning the loss of her old life that she hadn't seriously considered what her new life might be capable of. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She requested a meeting with Colonel Bradley and asked for permission to return to active training. The colonel's response was exactly what she expected: polite, concerned, and ultimately negative. He explained that while he admired her determination, the military had strict physical standards for active duty soldiers, and her injury made it impossible for her to meet those standards. But Sarah had done her research, and she knew that the regulations included provisions for soldiers with disabilities who could demonstrate that they were capable of performing their duties effectively. She asked for the opportunity to prove herself, to show that her skills as a marksman hadn't disappeared along with her leg. Colonel Bradley was reluctant, but Sarah's persistence and the strength of her service record eventually wore down his resistance. The agreement they reached was simple. Sarah would have one opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities on the rifle range. If she could match her previous performance standards, she would be allowed to return to active duty in a limited capacity. If she couldn't, she would accept the administrative role without further complaint. It was the kind of high-stakes test that Sarah had always thrived on, but it was also the most important challenge she had ever faced. Sarah spent the next 2 weeks preparing with an intensity that surprised even her. She practiced with her prosthetic until wearing it felt natural again, worked with physical therapists to optimize her balance and stability, and spent hours studying the technical aspects of marksmanship that she had previously understood intuitively. She knew that she would have only one chance to prove herself, and she was determined to make it count. The night before the test, Sarah lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months earlier, she had been a confident, accomplished soldier who had never seriously considered the possibility that her career might be derailed by circumstances beyond her control. Now she was someone who had learned that identity and capability were more complex and resilient than she had ever imagined. She thought about the accident, about the long weeks of recovery, about the well-meaning people who had encouraged her to accept limitations that she wasn't ready to accept. She thought about the junior officers who had written her off, about the colonel who had reluctantly agreed to give her this chance, and about her own journey from despair to determination. Tomorrow would determine not just her future in the military, but her understanding of who she really was and what she was capable of becoming. The morning of the test arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to cut straight through Sarah's uniform as she walked toward the rifle range. She had woken before dawn, not from an alarm, but from the restless energy that had been building in her chest for days. This was the moment that would define everything that came after, and she could feel the weight of that reality in every step she took. Colonel Bradley was already waiting at the range when Sarah arrived, along with Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who would be conducting the evaluation, and a small group of other personnel who had various official reasons for being present. Sarah noticed that some of her former unit members had also gathered at a respectful distance, and she couldn't tell if their presence was meant to be supportive or if they were simply curious to see how this unusual situation would unfold. The test itself was straightforward in concept, but demanding in execution. Sarah would need to demonstrate proficiency at various distances, from close-range precision shots to long-range targets, that would challenge even experienced marksmen. She would be scored on accuracy, consistency, and speed, with standards that matched those required of any active-duty soldier in her classification. There would be no accommodation for her prosthetic, no adjusted expectations, and no second chances. Master Sergeant Rodriguez explained the scoring system with professional detachment, but Sarah could see something in his expression that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. She had worked with Rodriguez before her accident, and she knew he respected her abilities, but she also understood that he was now in the difficult position of evaluating a soldier whose circumstances had changed dramatically since their last interaction. Sarah's first challenge was simply getting into proper shooting position. The prone stance that had once felt like second nature now required careful adjustment and conscious attention to balance. Her prosthetic leg didn't provide the same stability as her natural limb, and she found herself making micro-adjustments that she had never needed to consider before. But as she settled into position and felt the familiar weight of the rifle in her hands, something clicked into place that had been missing for months. The first target was set at 50 meters, a distance that should have been routine for someone with Sarah's experience. She took her time lining up the shot, feeling for that perfect moment when breath, balance, and focus aligned. When she squeezed the trigger, the rifle kicked against her shoulder with a satisfying familiarity, and she knew before looking through the spotting scope that the shot had found its mark. The bullet had struck the target just slightly left of center, close enough to the bullseye to be considered a solid hit, but not quite the perfect precision she had once taken for granted. Sarah felt a momentary flash of frustration, but she pushed it aside and focused on the next shot. The second bullet struck closer to center, and the third was nearly perfect. By the time she completed the first series, she was shooting with something approaching her old consistency. The 50-meter targets went well enough to keep her in contention, but Sarah knew the real test would come at longer distances, where the effects of any instability or inconsistency would be magnified. At 100 meters, she found herself struggling more noticeably with balance and having to work harder to maintain the steady breathing rhythm that accurate shooting required. Her scores were still within acceptable ranges, but they weren't the exceptional scores that had once made her stand out among her peers. As the test progressed to longer distances, Sarah became increasingly aware of the watching eyes around her. She could sense the tension in the group of observers, and she knew that everyone present understood the significance of what was happening. This wasn't just about one soldier's return to duty. It was about challenging assumptions about disability, capability, and the rigid standards that had traditionally defined military service. At 200 meters, Sarah encountered her first serious difficulty. The target seemed to dance in her scope, and she found herself fighting to maintain the rock-steady position that long-range accuracy demanded. Her first shot missed the scoring rings entirely, a failure that would have been unthinkable before her accident. She heard a subtle shift in the murmur of voices behind her and felt the familiar burn of embarrassment in her cheeks. But Sarah had learned something important during her months of recovery. Failure was only permanent if you allowed it to be. She took a deep breath, reset her position, and approached the next shot with the methodical precision that had served her well throughout her career. The second shot scored, and the third was even better. By the end of the 200-meter series, she had recovered enough to maintain a respectable average. The longest distance in the test was 300 meters, a range that separated competent marksmen from truly exceptional ones. Sarah had always excelled at long-range shooting, but now she faced the challenge with equipment that felt slightly foreign and a body that responded differently than it had for the first 28 years of her life. She knew this was where her future would ultimately be decided. Setting up for the 300-meter shots required even more careful attention to positioning and balance. Sarah found herself thinking about the physics of the shot in ways she never had before, consciously calculating the effects of wind and distance rather than relying on the intuitive feel that had once guided her shooting. It was a different approach, more analytical and deliberate, but she began to realize it might actually be more reliable than her previous instinctive method. Her first shot at 300 meters struck the target, but well outside the center rings. Sarah felt a moment of panic, wondering if she had overestimated her ability to adapt to these new circumstances. But as she prepared for the second shot, she found herself settling into a rhythm that felt different from her old shooting style, but no less effective. She was learning to work with her prosthetic rather than fighting against it, using the conscious control it required to enhance her precision rather than letting it undermine her confidence. The remaining long-range shots showed steady improvement, and by the final shot of the series, Sarah achieved something that surprised even her, a bullseye that would have been impressive for any shooter, regardless of physical circumstances. The satisfaction she felt wasn't just about the accuracy of the shot. It was about the realization that she had found a way to be excellent that was uniquely her own. When the formal scoring was complete, Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah with an expression that was hard to read. He had watched her shoot many times before the accident, and she could tell he was making mental comparisons between her current performance and her previous standards. The numbers on his scorecard would tell the official story, but Sarah knew that the real evaluation was more complex than any numerical score could capture. Colonel Bradley joined the conversation, and Sarah could see him weighing multiple considerations as he reviewed the results. Her scores were solid, clearly demonstrating competence and even moments of excellence, but they weren't quite at the level of her pre-accident performance. The question was whether the difference was significant enough to disqualify her from active duty or minor enough to be considered an acceptable adaptation to changed circumstances. The conversation that followed was one of the most important of Sarah's military career. Colonel Bradley acknowledged that her shooting was competent, and that she had demonstrated remarkable determination in adapting to her new circumstances. However, he expressed concerns about whether her current level of performance met the standards required for the specific role she had previously filled. Sarah listened to the colonel's reservations with growing frustration, but she also recognized that he was dealing with genuine concerns rather than simple prejudice. The military had standards for good reasons, and those standards couldn't be abandoned simply because someone had worked hard to overcome personal challenges. At the same time, she believed that her performance had demonstrated that those standards could be met, even if the path to meeting them was different from what it had been before. The debate might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by an unexpected voice. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, one of Sarah's former unit members who had been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward and asked permission to speak. Williams had served with Sarah on multiple deployments and had seen her perform under combat conditions that were far more demanding than any training exercise. Williams reminded Colonel Bradley that marksmanship was only one component of a soldier's value, and that Sarah's experience, tactical knowledge, and leadership abilities were assets that couldn't be easily replaced. He pointed out that her shooting scores, while not quite at her previous level, were still better than those of many soldiers currently serving in active roles. Most importantly, he argued that her determination to overcome her circumstances had demonstrated exactly the kind of resilience and adaptability that made for effective soldiers. The intervention from William seemed to shift something in Colonel Bradley's thinking. Rather than focusing solely on whether Sarah's current performance matched her previous performance, he began to consider whether it was sufficient for the roles that needed to be filled. The military was always in need of skilled personnel, and Sarah's combination of experience and proven ability made her valuable even if she was operating at something less than her previous peak. After what felt like an eternity of discussion, Colonel Bradley made his decision. Sarah would be returned to active duty status, but with some modifications to her role that would maximize her strengths while acknowledging the realities of her situation. She would serve as both a marksman and an instructor, using her experience to train other soldiers while continuing to develop her own adapted techniques. The announcement was met with a mix of reactions from the watching personnel. Some seemed genuinely pleased by Sarah's success, others appeared uncertain about the precedent being set, and a few looked frankly skeptical about whether the decision was wise. Sarah herself felt a complex combination of relief, satisfaction, and determination to prove that the confidence placed in her was justified. As the group began to disperse, Sarah remained at the rifle range for a few extra minutes, looking out at the targets that had served as the proving ground for this crucial test. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, and about the longer journey that lay ahead. She had won the right to continue serving, but she knew that the real challenge would be demonstrating day after day that she could fulfill the responsibilities that came with that opportunity. Walking back toward the main base, Sarah felt different than she had in months. The weight of uncertainty that had been pressing down on her was finally beginning to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and possibility. She had proven something important to Colonel Bradley and Master Sergeant Rodriguez, but more importantly, she had proven something to herself. Her capabilities had changed, but they hadn't disappeared, and she was learning that adaptation could be a form of strength rather than admission of weakness. 3 weeks into her return to active duty, Sarah discovered that passing the test had been the easy part. The real challenge wasn't proving she could shoot, it was navigating the complex social dynamics of a military unit where her presence had become a source of ongoing debate and speculation. Some of her fellow soldiers were genuinely supportive, others were politely neutral, and a few made no effort to hide their skepticism about whether special accommodations should be made for anyone, regardless of their circumstances. The training schedule that Colonel Bradley had designed for Sarah was comprehensive and demanding. She spent her mornings working with new recruits on basic marksmanship, her afternoons participating in tactical exercises with experienced soldiers, and her evenings studying advanced shooting techniques and adaptive strategies. It was exactly the kind of challenging, multifaceted role she had hoped for, but it also meant she was constantly under observation by people who were forming opinions about whether her return to service was working out as planned. Her first real test came during a joint training exercise with units from neighboring bases. Sarah was assigned to serve as both participant and instructor for a complex scenario that involved multiple shooting positions, moving targets, and time pressure that simulated combat conditions. She had been looking forward to the exercise as an opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities in a more realistic setting. But she quickly realized that not everyone was approaching it with the same professional focus. General Robert Hawkins was visiting from the regional command headquarters to observe the training exercise, and his reputation preceded him. Known for his old-school approach to military standards and his skepticism about recent changes in military policy, Hawkins had built his career on the principle that the armed forces should maintain the highest possible standards regardless of political or social pressure. Sarah had never met him personally, but she had heard enough stories to know that earning his respect would require exceptional performance under pressure. The exercise began well enough, with Sarah successfully completing the initial shooting challenges and providing clear, helpful instruction to the soldiers working under her guidance. But as the scenarios became more complex and physically demanding, she began to notice that General Hawkins was paying particular attention to her performance, often positioning himself where he could observe her closely and occasionally making notes on the tablet he carried. The moment that would define the entire exercise occurred during a particularly challenging sequence that required rapid movement between shooting positions while maintaining accuracy under time pressure. Sarah had completed similar exercises many times before her accident, but the prosthetic added an element of complexity that required more careful planning and execution than her previous instinctive approach. As she moved from the third shooting position to the fourth, her prosthetic caught on an uneven piece of terrain and caused her to stumble slightly. She recovered quickly and completed the sequence within the acceptable time limit, but the brief moment of imbalance had been visible to everyone watching, including General Hawkins. Sarah felt a flash of frustration, not because she had stumbled, but because she knew that single moment would overshadow everything else she accomplished during the exercise. What happened next was worse than anything Sarah could have anticipated. During the post-exercise debrief, General Hawkins stood before the assembled soldiers and began discussing his observations about the training. He praised several aspects of the exercise and offered constructive criticism about areas that needed improvement. But when he came to discussing adaptive equipment and special accommodations, his tone shifted noticeably. Looking directly at Sarah, General Hawkins made a comment that would burn itself into her memory forever. He suggested that while he appreciated the desire to be inclusive and supportive of soldiers who had made sacrifices in service to their country, the military could not allow sentiment to override practical considerations about combat effectiveness. He observed that prosthetic devices, no matter how advanced, were inherently less reliable than natural limbs, and that soldiers who depended on such devices represented potential liabilities in situations where lives depended on peak performance. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. General Hawkins wasn't just criticizing Sarah's performance. He was questioning the fundamental premise that soldiers with disabilities could serve effectively in active roles. He was suggesting that her presence in the unit was more about political correctness than military effectiveness, and that her stumble during the exercise had demonstrated exactly the kind of reliability concerns he had been worried about. Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment and anger, but military protocol prevented her from responding directly to a general's comments during an official debrief. She stood at attention and maintained her professional composure, but inside she was struggling with a combination of rage, humiliation, and self-doubt that threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed confidence. The general continued his remarks, noting that modern prosthetics were impressive pieces of technology but that they required more conscious attention and maintenance than natural limbs. He suggested that soldiers who needed to think about their equipment during high-stress situations were at a fundamental disadvantage compared to those who could rely on instinctive responses. His tone was clinical and matter-of-fact, but his message was unmistakably clear. Sarah didn't belong in an active combat role. After the debrief ended, Sarah found herself surrounded by an awkward mixture of sympathetic colleagues and others who seemed uncertain about how to react to what they had just witnessed. Some offered words of support and reassurance, but Sarah could see in their eyes that General Hawkins' comments had planted seeds of doubt about her capabilities. Others avoided eye contact entirely, apparently uncomfortable with being associated with what had become a controversial situation. The impact of the general's public criticism extended far beyond the immediate embarrassment. Over the following days, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how she was treated by other personnel. Instructions that had previously been delivered in a straightforward professional manner now often included extra explanations or redundant safety reminders. Training assignments that had been challenging but appropriate suddenly seemed to include more observers and backup personnel than similar exercises with other soldiers. Most painfully, Sarah began to notice that some of her fellow soldiers were unconsciously treating her as if she were fragile or unreliable. Conversations would pause when she approached, as if people were editing their remarks to avoid topics that might be sensitive. Offers of assistance came more frequently, and with a tone that suggested the helpers assumed she needed more support than she was asking for. The psychological effect of this changed treatment was more damaging than any physical challenge Sarah had faced during her recovery. She had worked so hard to prove that her capabilities hadn't fundamentally changed, but now she was being treated as if her presence required special consideration and accommodation. The confidence she had rebuilt through months of training and preparation began to erode under the constant reminder that others saw her as different and potentially problematic. Sarah's performance began to suffer as her self-doubt grew. She found herself second-guessing decisions that had once been automatic, overthinking movements that had become natural, and constantly monitoring her own actions for signs of the limitations that others seemed to expect. The more she worried about proving General Hawkins wrong, the more likely she became to make exactly the kinds of mistakes that seemed to confirm his skepticism. The situation reached a crisis point during a routine training exercise 2 weeks after the general's visit. Sarah was working with a group of junior soldiers on precision shooting techniques when one of them asked a question about adaptive equipment for disabled soldiers. The question itself was innocent and professionally relevant, but the way it was phrased made it clear that the soldier saw Sarah primarily through the lens of her disability rather than her expertise. Sarah answered the question professionally, but she could feel something fundamental shifting in her relationship with her role and her identity. She was no longer just a soldier who happened to use a prosthetic. She had become the disabled soldier whose presence required explanation and justification. The distinction was subtle but crucial, and it marked a transformation from someone who was overcoming challenges to someone who was defined by them. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters and seriously considered requesting a transfer back to administrative duties. The prospect of continuing to fight for acceptance and respect felt exhausting, especially when it seemed that every small setback would be interpreted as evidence of larger limitations. She wondered if General Hawkins had been right about the practical considerations of military service, and if her determination to return to active duty was based more on stubbornness than realistic assessment of her capabilities. But as Sarah wrestled with these doubts, she also found herself thinking about the larger implications of giving up now. Her situation had become a test case that would influence how the military treated other soldiers with disabilities in the future. If she retreated to a desk job after General Hawkins' criticism, it would send a message that his concerns had been valid and that adaptive accommodations were indeed incompatible with effective military service. The decision that emerged from Sarah's night of soul-searching wasn't based on confidence or optimism. It was based on the recognition that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost, and that her individual struggle had become connected to larger questions about inclusion, capability, and the evolving nature of military service. She couldn't control how others perceived her, but she could control how she responded to their perceptions. The next morning, Sarah requested a meeting with Colonel Bradley to discuss her ongoing role and to propose a more aggressive approach to demonstrating her capabilities. Rather than simply trying to fit into existing structures, she wanted to take on challenges that would definitively prove that her adaptive techniques could be not just adequate, but superior to conventional approaches. She was tired of being defensive about her prosthetic, and she was ready to start using it as a strategic advantage rather than seeing it as a limitation to overcome. Colonel Bradley listened to her proposal with interest, but also with visible concern about the risks she was suggesting. Sarah was essentially asking for the opportunity to fail spectacularly in front of the same people who had already expressed doubts about her capabilities. If she succeeded, it would silence her critics and establish a new model for inclusive military service. If she failed, it would confirm their worst assumptions and potentially end her military career permanently. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and both Sarah and Colonel Bradley understood that they were making decisions that would have consequences far beyond one soldier's career trajectory. But Sarah had reached a point where playing it safe felt more dangerous than taking bold risks, and she was ready to bet everything on her ability to transform skepticism into respect through undeniable excellence. The opportunity Sarah had been waiting for came in an unexpected form. 3 weeks after her meeting with Colonel Bradley, intelligence reports indicated unusual activity in a border region where drug trafficking and armed smuggling had been increasing steadily over the past several months. A joint task force was being assembled to conduct reconnaissance and potentially intervene in situations where civilian law enforcement was insufficient to handle the threat level. The mission profile was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes operation that would normally be assigned to the most experienced and reliable personnel available. It required precision shooting at potentially long ranges, the ability to operate effectively in difficult terrain, and the mental resilience to make critical decisions under extreme pressure. Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have been an obvious choice for inclusion in such a mission. But given the recent questions about her capabilities, her selection would represent either a strong vote of confidence or a calculated risk that could backfire dramatically. Colonel Bradley called Sarah into his office on a Tuesday morning and laid out the situation with characteristic directness. The task force needed someone with her specific combination of marksmanship skills and tactical experience, but assigning her to such a high-profile operation would inevitably attract scrutiny from higher-level commanders, including potentially General Hawkins himself. If the mission went well, it would definitively establish her value as an active-duty soldier. If anything went wrong that could be attributed to her limitations, it would provide ammunition for those who believed she should never have been returned to active duty. Sarah listened to the colonel's explanation with growing excitement and determination. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had been hoping for. A chance to prove her worth in a real-world situation where the stakes were genuine and the evaluation criteria were objective results, rather than subjective opinions about her limitations. She accepted the assignment immediately, before Colonel Bradley had even finished explaining all the potential risks and complications. The task force assembled at a staging area near the border 3 days later. Sarah found herself working with soldiers from multiple units, most of whom she had never met before. This was both advantageous and challenging. They had no preconceived notions about her capabilities based on her accident and recovery, but they also had no established trust in her abilities based on previous collaboration. The mission commander, Major Lisa Chen, had an impressive record of successful operations and a reputation for making personnel decisions based solely on competence and reliability. During the initial briefings, Sarah was encouraged to see that Major Chen treated her exactly like any other member of the team, with no special attention to her prosthetic or obvious concern about her ability to handle the demands of the operation. The intelligence picture that emerged during the planning sessions was complex and potentially dangerous. The smuggling operation they were investigating involved well-armed groups with military-style training and equipment. Previous encounters had revealed that these weren't simply criminals trying to avoid law enforcement. They were organized, disciplined units capable of sustained combat against professional soldiers. Sarah's role in the mission was to serve as the primary sniper for the team, providing overwatch and precision fire support from concealed positions, while other elements maneuvered closer to the target areas. It was a responsibility that would require her to operate independently for extended periods, making critical decisions about when and where to engage targets based on rapidly changing tactical situations. The terrain in the operational area was challenging even for soldiers with full mobility. Rocky, uneven ground covered with dense vegetation would make movement difficult and require careful attention to footing and balance. Sarah spent extra time during the pre-mission preparation studying topographical maps and satellite imagery, identifying potential shooting positions, and planning movement routes that would work with her prosthetic rather than against it. 2 days into the mission, the task force made contact with the smuggling group, under circumstances that were both more complex and more dangerous than the intelligence reports had suggested. What they encountered wasn't a simple smuggling operation, but a sophisticated network that included former military personnel and advanced equipment that posed a serious threat to both the mission and the safety of the team members. The engagement began at dawn, when one of the reconnaissance teams stumbled into a well-concealed outpost that the enemy had established to monitor approaches to their main compound. The ensuing firefight quickly escalated as both sides called for reinforcements, and the tactical situation became increasingly complicated by the difficult terrain and the need to avoid civilian casualties in a nearby village. Sarah found herself in a shooting position approximately 800 meters from the main area of engagement, with clear lines of sight to several key points where enemy personnel were attempting to establish defensive positions. The range was at the upper limit of what most soldiers could handle effectively, but it was well within Sarah's capabilities, even accounting for the adjustments she had made to her shooting technique since her accident. Her first shots were carefully aimed at enemy personnel who were setting up a heavy machine gun that could have dominated the battlefield and put the entire task force at serious risk. The combination of distance, wind conditions, and the stress of actual combat made these among the most challenging shots Sarah had ever attempted, but her months of training and preparation had given her confidence in her adapted techniques. The first shot struck its target precisely, eliminating the machine gun team before they could bring their weapon into action. The second and third shots disrupted an attempt to establish a mortar position that could have provided the enemy with indirect fire capability against the advancing task force members. Each successful engagement removed a significant threat and gave the friendly forces more freedom of movement and action. But Sarah's most crucial contribution to the mission came when the tactical situation took an unexpected turn. Intelligence reports had indicated that the smuggling operation was primarily concerned with moving contraband across the border, but it became clear during the engagement that they were also holding several civilian hostages who had apparently been captured during previous operations in the area. The presence of hostages transformed the mission from a straightforward combat operation into a complex rescue scenario that required precise coordination and exceptional marksmanship to ensure the safety of the innocent civilians. Era found herself in the position of providing cover for the rescue team, while simultaneously engaging enemy personnel who were using the hostages' location as a shield against direct assault. The shot that would define Sarah's career came when an enemy sniper took a position that threatened the rescue team's approach route. The hostile marksman was approximately 900 meters from Sarah's position, partially concealed behind cover that made a clean shot extremely difficult. Worse yet, the angle of engagement meant that any miss could potentially endanger the hostages the team was trying to rescue. Sarah studied the situation through her scope for several minutes, calculating wind speed and direction, estimating the effects of the morning heat on bullet trajectory, and planning for the slight movements of both her target and the potential civilian casualties in the background. It was exactly the kind of shot that separated competent marksmen from exceptional ones, and she knew that her entire career might be judged by the outcome of this single moment. The fundamentals of marksmanship that Sarah had learned early in her career became crucial as she prepared to take the shot. Proper breathing, steady positioning, smooth trigger control, and complete follow-through were all essential, but now she also had to account for the ways her prosthetic affected her stance and balance. Rather than fighting against these changes, she had learned to incorporate them into a shooting technique that was uniquely suited to her current capabilities. When Sarah finally squeezed the trigger, she felt the familiar kick of the rifle against her shoulder, and the satisfaction of a shot that felt perfect from the moment of release. Through her scope, she saw the enemy sniper drop away from his position, eliminating the threat to both the rescue team and the hostages they were trying to protect. It was a shot that would have been impressive under any circumstances, but given the pressure of the situation and the stakes involved, it represented the kind of performance that builds legends. The successful elimination of the enemy sniper allowed the rescue team to complete their approach and secure the hostages without further casualties. The remainder of the engagement proceeded smoothly, with the smuggling operation disrupted and several key personnel captured for intelligence purposes. From a tactical standpoint, the mission was an unqualified success that achieved all its primary objectives while minimizing friendly casualties and collateral damage. But for Sarah, the personal significance of the mission went far beyond its tactical success. She had proven to herself and to her colleagues that her adapted techniques weren't just adequate substitutes for her previous capabilities. They were potentially superior approaches that allowed her to perform at the highest levels under the most demanding circumstances. The months of doubt and self-questioning had been replaced by a quiet confidence based on demonstrated excellence rather than hopeful determination. The after-action reports from Major Chen and other mission participants were uniformly positive about Sarah's performance, with specific praise for her precision under pressure and her ability to make critical decisions independently. More importantly, the reports made no reference to her prosthetic or any accommodations that had been necessary because of her disability. She was evaluated purely on her results, exactly as she had always wanted to be. When the task force returned to base, Sarah found that word of her performance had spread quickly through the military network. Soldiers who had previously treated her with polite skepticism now approached her with genuine respect and professional curiosity about her techniques. The questions she received were no longer about how she coped with her limitations, but about how she had developed such exceptional capabilities under challenging circumstances. Colonel Bradley debriefed Sarah personally and made it clear that her performance had exceeded everyone's expectations, including his own. The successful mission had demonstrated conclusively that her return to active duty had been the right decision, and that the concerns raised by General Hawkins had been based on assumptions rather than accurate assessments of her capabilities. But even as Sarah celebrated this professional vindication, she knew that her story was far from over. The military was a large organization with many different perspectives and priorities, and one successful mission wouldn't necessarily change all the attitudes and policies that affected soldiers with disabilities. She had won an important battle, but the larger war for acceptance and inclusion would require sustained excellence over time rather than single moments of dramatic success. 6 months after the border mission that had transformed her from a controversial experiment into a respected professional, Sarah found herself standing in a conference room at the Pentagon, briefing senior military officials about adaptive techniques for soldiers with disabilities. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now being asked to advise the same organization that had once questioned whether she belonged in uniform at all. The invitation to speak at the Pentagon had come through official channels, but Sarah suspected that Major Chen's after-action reports and Colonel Bradley's advocacy had played a significant role in bringing her to the attention of policymakers at the highest levels of military command. The military was facing increasing pressure to demonstrate that it could effectively integrate personnel with disabilities, and Sarah's success story provided a concrete example of how such integration could work in practice. The audience for her presentation included generals, colonels, policy analysts, and medical specialists who were responsible for developing guidelines that would affect thousands of current and future military personnel. Sarah had prepared extensively for the briefing, but she also understood that her most powerful arguments would come from her own experience, rather than from theoretical discussions about capability and accommodation. General Patricia Morrison, who was leading the Policy Review Committee, introduced Sarah with remarks that emphasized both her exceptional performance and the broader significance of her career trajectory. The general noted that Sarah's success had important implications not just for military personnel policy, but for society's understanding of disability, adaptation, and human potential. Sarah began her presentation by acknowledging the complexity of the issues involved in integrating soldiers with disabilities into active duty roles. She explained that her own journey had taught her that the most important considerations weren't medical or technical, but psychological and cultural. The biggest barriers she had faced weren't physical limitations, but assumptions about what those limitations meant for her capability and reliability. The core of Sarah's message was that disability didn't necessarily mean inability, but it did mean difference. Rather than trying to minimize or ignore those differences, military policy should focus on understanding how they could be leveraged as strengths rather than simply accommodated as weaknesses. Her prosthetic, for example, had forced her to develop more analytical and deliberate shooting techniques that were actually more consistent and reliable than her previous instinctive methods. Sarah used specific examples from her recent missions to illustrate how adaptive techniques could provide tactical advantages in certain situations. Her need to plan movements more carefully had made her better at terrain analysis and route selection. Her conscious attention to balance and positioning had improved her ability to shoot accurately from unconventional positions. Her experience with equipment maintenance and troubleshooting had made her more resourceful in field conditions. But Sarah also emphasized that her success had depended heavily on having colleagues and superiors who were willing to evaluate her based on results rather than assumptions. She praised Colonel Bradley, Major Chen, and others who had given her opportunities to prove herself rather than automatically limiting her based on preconceived notions about disability. The questions from the audience revealed the complexity of the challenges facing military policymakers. Some officials were concerned about legal liability and the potential costs of providing accommodations. Others worried about unit cohesion and the possibility that special considerations for some soldiers might create resentment or undermine standards. Still others questioned whether Sarah's individual success could be scaled up to address the needs of larger numbers of personnel with various types of disabilities. Sarah answered these questions with the same directness and professional competence that had characterized her military service. She acknowledged that not every soldier with a disability would be able to return to active duty, just as not every soldier without a disability was suited for every military role. The key was developing evaluation processes that focused on actual capabilities rather than assumed limitations. The most challenging question came from General Robert Hawkins, who had flown in specifically to participate in the briefing. His presence in the room created a tension that everyone could feel, and Sarah knew that his response to her presentation could significantly influence its ultimate impact on military policy. General Hawkins asked whether Sarah believed her individual success justified changing standards that had been developed over decades to ensure military effectiveness. He noted that exceptional individuals could sometimes overcome limitations that would be disabling for most people, but that policy had to be based on typical rather than exceptional cases. Sarah's response to General Hawkins was the culmination of everything she had learned during her journey from injury to redemption. She acknowledged that she might indeed be exceptional in some ways, but argued that exceptionalism wasn't necessarily about natural talent or luck. It was about the willingness to work harder, think differently, and persist in the face of obstacles that might cause others to give up. She pointed out that the military had always been in the business of taking ordinary people and helping them become extraordinary through training, discipline, and experience. The same principles that turned civilians into soldiers could be applied to helping soldiers with disabilities discover new ways to excel. The question wasn't whether people with disabilities could meet military standards, but whether the military was creative and flexible enough to help them find the paths to excellence that worked for their individual circumstances. General Hawkins listened to Sarah's response with the same clinical attention he had shown during their first encounter, but this time his expression reflected consideration rather than skepticism. When she finished speaking, he asked a follow-up question that surprised everyone in the room. He wanted to know what specific changes in training and evaluation procedures Sarah would recommend to help other soldiers with disabilities achieve similar success. The conversation that followed was the most productive discussion about disability and military service that many of the participants had ever experienced. Rather than focusing on limitations and accommodations, the group began exploring possibilities and innovations. Sarah found herself at the center of a collaborative planning process that could potentially transform the military's approach to personnel with disabilities. Over the following months, Sarah's recommendations began to be implemented in pilot programs at several military installations. These programs focused on individualized assessment and training rather than blanket exclusions based on disability categories. Soldiers with various types of disabilities were given opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities and develop adaptive techniques with the same kind of support and resources that Sarah had received. The results of these pilot programs exceeded everyone's expectations. While not every participant achieved Sarah's level of success, a significant percentage were able to return to active duty roles that utilized their strengths while accommodating their limitations. More importantly, the programs began to change attitudes throughout the military about the relationship between disability and capability. Sarah's own career continued to evolve in directions she had never anticipated. In addition to her regular duties as a marksman and instructor, she became a consultant on adaptive techniques and a mentor for other soldiers facing similar challenges. Her expertise was sought not just within the military, but by law enforcement agencies, athletic organizations, and medical professionals who were working with people trying to overcome physical limitations. The transformation in how Sarah was perceived by her colleagues was perhaps the most satisfying aspect of her success. She was no longer seen as the disabled soldier who had been given special consideration, but as the innovative soldier who had developed superior techniques for challenging situations. Junior officers sought her advice, experienced soldiers wanted to learn her methods, and senior commanders valued her unique perspectives on tactical problems. 2 years after her accident, Sarah received a promotion that recognized both her individual excellence and her contributions to military policy and training. The promotion ceremony was attended by many of the people who had been part of her journey, including Colonel Bradley, Major Chen, and even General Hawkins, who had become one of the strongest advocates for the adaptive training programs that Sarah had helped develop. In her acceptance speech, Sarah reflected on the lessons she had learned about resilience, adaptation, and the importance of not allowing others to define your limitations for you. She spoke about the difference between accommodation and innovation, and about how challenges that seemed like obstacles could become sources of strength if approached with creativity and determination. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah talked about the responsibility that came with success. She had proven that soldiers with disabilities could excel in active duty roles, but that success created an obligation to help others find their own paths to excellence. The real measure of her achievement wouldn't be her individual accomplishments, but the opportunities those accomplishments created for others who were facing similar challenges. Sarah's story had become more than just a personal triumph over adversity. It had become a catalyst for institutional change that would affect military personnel for generations to come. The policies and programs that grew out of her experience would help countless other soldiers discover that their limitations didn't have to define their possibilities. As Sarah stood before the assembled officers and dignitaries, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The accident that had once seemed like the end of everything she valued had actually been the beginning of a more meaningful and impactful career than she had ever imagined possible. She had learned that true strength wasn't about having all your pieces intact. It was about making the pieces you had count in ways that mattered. The young soldier she had been before the accident had been competent and dedicated, but she had also been limited by conventional thinking about what was possible and what was acceptable. The woman she had become was not just a better soldier, but a better leader, teacher, and advocate for others who were told they couldn't achieve their dreams. Sarah's prosthetic leg had become a symbol not of limitation, but of the human capacity to adapt, innovate, and excel regardless of the obstacles that life presents. Her rifle had become an instrument not just of military precision, but of personal and professional transformation that proved the power of refusing to accept other people's assumptions about what you could accomplish. The hero that General Hawkins had once ridiculed had indeed taken her rifle and proven him wrong, but she had done something more important than silencing a critic. She had opened doors for others, changed institutions for the better, and demonstrated that excellence was not about perfection, but about the courage to be extraordinary in whatever circumstances you found yourself facing.